What's happening everyone, my name is Alex and welcome back. In today's video we're checking out the differences between the Vivo V30 Pro, so the one that I have to my left here, and the Vivo V30, the one that I have to my right here. Now, even though these two phones look pretty similar, there are some differences in between the two. I've also included a short camera comparison between these two devices, and if you want to check that out, that one starts at this minute of this video. Alright, let's start by checking out the boxes and see what comes in the box for each device. Alright, so for boxes, everything is pretty much the same except for the writing outside of the box. So of course, V30 versus V30 Pro. So inside the box, you're gonna find a silicone case for each device. We have some booklets, we have a cable in there, and we also have a 80-watt fast charger. So both devices support 80-watt fast charging. So charging each device from 0 to 100 takes about 45 to 49 minutes, depending how hot the device is and so on. So very quick charging for both devices, and both devices have a 5000 milliamp hour battery inside. Now, looks-wise, they do look very similar. I mean, if you're not paying attention, you can barely tell them apart. The only difference that you're gonna notice is for the camera systems on the back. So the Vivo V30 Pro does have an extra camera on the back, but we'll talk about cameras later on. Other than that, everything is pretty much the same. The frames are the same, the ports are all the same, so everything is the same. The Vivo V30 Pro here weighs 188 grams, where the V30 here weighs 186 grams. So 2 grams lighter for this one, but other than that, everything is the same. Now, I've seen this question quite a few times for this device when I posted the video for this device. So both devices only have one speaker, and that speaker is at the bottom here. So they do not get dual speakers. So the same as it was with the V29, so basically the previous release. So only one speaker on the V30 Pro and of course the V30. And the speakers do sound identical. Alright, so aside from the camera systems that are a bit different on these two devices, we also have different chipsets. So inside the Vivo V30 Pro here, we have the MediaTek Dimensity 8200. Where inside the V30 we have the Snapdragon 7 Gen 3. And I know that the comments will be divided. Some people do prefer those Snapdragon chipsets over the MediaTek chipsets. Now let me show you the scores that we got on the AnTuTu benchmark here. So the V30 Pro does get a somewhat higher score. But I also noticed that the V30 Pro does run hotter whenever you're playing games, whenever you're doing more graphic intensive tasks on the device. So yes, the V30 Pro is a bit more powerful, but also runs a bit hotter. I did notice that whenever I play games on the V30, the phone doesn't really get that hot, where that's not the case with this one. For internal storage, so I have the versions with 512 gigs of internal storage for both, and here it seems that the V30 Pro does have the faster internal storage as well, so something to keep in mind as well. And I've also ran the Geekbench 6 test on both devices, and here once again we do get a higher multi-core score on the V30 Pro, so we get a 3900 multi-core score on this one, where on the V30 we get a 3200 score. So yes, on paper the V30 Pro is the more powerful device, but whenever you use the device for day-to-day usage, it's actually hard to tell which one is which, so they both perform equally good. Moving on to screens, well, here for screens you're not really gonna find any difference. So both devices have the same 6.78 inches AMOLED screen that has a refresh rate of 120 Hz and the same peak brightness at 2800 nits. So for budget-friendly phones, you can definitely see these ones outside really well. Now, there is a difference that I've noticed. So if we open settings and display and brightness, on the Vivo V30 here, you can actually change the screen resolution, where on the V30 Pro, you cannot change the screen resolution. So that's really the only difference that I've noticed in between these two. So beautiful looking screens on both devices, even though I think it's time that they move back to flat screens and we don't get these curved screens anymore. Moving on to cameras and starting with the front-facing cameras. So we have a 50 megapixel camera on the front of each device, as you can see there. So the same camera, and the only difference that you're gonna notice here is for the video capabilities. So the V30 Pro here can actually record in 4K at 60 frames per second with that front-facing camera, where the maximum recording resolution for the front-facing camera for the V30 is 4K at 30 frames per second. Now, the downside when recording in 4K at 60 frames per second is the fact that you don't get video stabilization at 4K at 60 frames per second, so you're better off to record in 4K at 30 frames per second. And let me show you quickly a recording that I've done with the front-facing cameras on both devices in 4K at 30 frames per second. Alright, and we're moving on to our next recording. For this recording, I'm using the front-facing cameras on the V30 and of course the V30 Pro. For this recording, I'm doing 4K at 30 frames per second with both devices, but with the V30 Pro, you could actually record in 4K at 60 frames per second, something that you cannot do with the V30. So something to keep in mind. So I'm gonna walk a bit faster just so you can see how the video stabilization works on both devices, and also do a bit of running. And we'll stop somewhere around here. So front-facing cameras on the V30 and of course the V30 Pro. So what do you think about those recordings done with the front-facing cameras on these two devices? Definitely leave a comment and let me know your thoughts. Alright, moving on to the backs here. Well, the camera systems here are a bit different because here we have an extra camera. That extra camera is actually used for portrait mode pictures. So that's the main purpose of that camera. And you can kind of use it as a telephoto lens in a way, because it is a bit more zoomed in than the regular camera. So you basically get kind of like a telephoto lens that's also a portrait mode camera, if that makes some sense. So whenever you're gonna take pictures further away, the pictures will be sharper from the V30 Pro compared to the V30 because we don't have that other camera. Now, the main difference here, once again, is for the video recording. So the V30 Pro here can do 4K at 60 frames per second, where the V30 can only do 4K at 30 frames per second. As I said for the previous front-facing camera, the downside whenever you're recording in 4K at 60 frames per second is the fact that you don't get video stabilization. So you're better off to actually record in 4K at 30 frames per second. So let me show you some recordings that I've done with the rear cameras here, and then I'll come back so I can show you some pictures. Alright, we have a quick video sample between the Vivo V30 and of course the Vivo V30 Pro. For this recording, I'm using the main cameras on the back of both devices and recording in 4K at 30 frames per second. Now, with the Vivo V30 Pro, you can also record in 4K at 60 frames per second. However, this recording is done in 4K at 30 frames per second. So you're gonna pan left this way and a bit to the right. I'm actually gonna spin around and we'll walk this way again, and I'm actually gonna do a bit of running just so you can see how that video stabilization does. So we'll stop somewhere around here. So Vivo V30 and Vivo V30 Pro. Another thing I want to show you and another thing I want to mention, so if you're recording in 4K at 60 frames per second with the Vivo V30 Pro, so I'm doing 4K at 60 frames per second with that one, I'm doing 4K at 30 frames per second with the V30. So at 4K at 60 frames per second, you do not get video stabilization. So if you're walking, if you're moving around, your video is gonna look kind of shaky. So that kind of defeats the purpose of having that 4K at 60 frames per second capability, I'm gonna say. So you're probably better off to film in 4K at 30 frames per second with both devices. And we're moving on to another quick recording between the V30 and of course the V30 Pro with the main cameras. Once again, I'm doing 4K at 30 frames per second for this particular recording. We do have a combination of sunshine and shade, and of course I wanted to show you how both phones would capture this kind of setting. We'll get closer to these flowers here. So yeah, 4K at 30 frames per second with the main cameras on the V30 and of course the V30 Pro. Now the sun is basically right in front of me. Another small difference between the V30 and the V30 Pro is the recording resolution for the ultra-wide cameras. So we are currently using the ultra-wide cameras on the back of both devices. So the maximum recording resolution on the V30 with that ultra-wide camera is 1080p at 30 frames per second, where the maximum recording resolution on the Vivo V30 Pro is 4K at 60 frames per second. However, if you are recording in 4K at 60 frames per second, you do not get video stabilization. So you do have to film at 4K at 30 frames per second to get video stabilization, and that is the resolution that I'm using now. So 1080p at 30 frames per second with the V30 and 4K at 30 frames per second on the V30 Pro with that ultra-wide camera. Alright, so next we are moving on to a quick recording done with the main cameras on the back of the two devices, recording in 4K at 30 frames per second. As you can see for yourself, it is night out, so that's why the low light recording. So I'm just gonna walk this way. It is a bit darker around here. I'm not sure how much you're gonna be able to see. So we'll walk this way. We're gonna stop here. We're gonna pan right. Actually, let's walk a step this way. And we'll pan up towards the castle there. So from what I'm seeing on the screen here, the video from the V30 Pro does have a bit less noise. Not a big difference, but a bit of a difference for sure. So this is how a low light recording between these two devices would look like. So what do you think about the video capabilities from these two devices? Is it worth spending the extra money to get a V30 Pro, or do you find that the V30 is good enough? Because I find that 4K at 30 frames per second is more than enough for most situations. I don't think I would actually use that 4K at 60 frames per second resolution ever, mostly because there is no video stabilization. Alright, so next I'm going to show you some pictures that I took with both devices during the day and at night, and I'll basically let you guys decide if there is a difference in between these two devices. From what I've seen, you can take decent looking pictures with the V30 Pro and with the V30. It really depends on the situation, how you're taking the picture and so on, but both devices do quite well for pictures as well. So let me show you some pictures and I will be right back. So to quickly conclude this video, yes, the V30 Pro here is slightly more powerful. We have an extra camera and the 4K at 60 frames per second resolution for video recordings. Here the V30 can still do 4K at 30, which I feel that is good enough. It's also a bit cheaper. It does run a bit cooler whenever you're playing games and stuff. And because of that, I feel that the V30 here does offer the better value in between these two devices. Because paying a bit more for the V30 Pro, I don't know if you're actually getting that value. But with the V30 here, you're definitely getting really good value. Alright guys, hopefully you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching and I'll see you guys in the next one.